They're just, those memory devices for us. But they're up here. They're in our imagination. What is the United States of America? Well, when you look at the Earth from space, I don't know. What it is, it's the combined interactions and interrelationships of what we've agreed to or what we've been dictated in law. All of the protected privileges. As James, you said, what is the Constitution? The Constitution is a guarantee, a protection of private property rights, and by extension, commercial rights. The Commerce Clause. It's why we have the Constitution we have now instead of the Articles of Confederation. It was well, to use the right term for it, a conspiracy to get rid of the first Constitution and create the second one to make it a private property protecting document.
Then can we wrap it?
Yes. By extension, one last piece.
Yeah.
One piece of the Constitution, and this is like emblematic to me. We had a civil war and we got rid of slavery. The ownership of one human being by another, where one human being was property and the other human being had private property rights protected by the Constitution, right in that Constitution. Now, we got rid of slavery in the 13th Amendment in 1868. One thing we didn't get rid of, it's right there, in the Fugitive Slave Clause, where it says that slaves, if they escape, that the state they escape into has a positive duty to return it to the owner, because private property rights are superior to the human and civil rights of the escaped slave, and there is no due process. There's no hearing to find out if that slave, claimed slave, is actually property or not. We got rid of we had the 13th Amendment, got rid of slavery. We did not get rid of the theory of law in our Constitution that says private property rights are superior to human and civil rights. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Is there any comment or question relating at all to this, or something that really is burning with anyone right now?
Two things. One is the idea of commons and the idea of civil society being successively eliminated from the establishment of rule of law. So I have a question about, is law part of the commons? Is it something that can be created over and over again by the civil society in its own way? And the other one is violence. Now everybody's, rising up to get into the streets, and they're being met with violence. So where does this fit in? I mean, do we have to all gird our loins and be ready to be arrested and beaten up and maybe killed, tortured, whatever? So to change the system, that's okay.
Do one of you have a burning desire to take that?
I'm not quite clear on what your link between civil society and law is. I was saying civil society is afraid to challenge constitutional premises of private property.
Well, I'm talking about civil society as the people. So let's just call us the people then.
Right. Well, I mean, very simply, I think we've been conditioned not to. We've been conditioned to feel fairly disempowered, so that even when we're single issue groups, as many aspects of civil society actually are, we really don't have the gumption to be able to make these challenges effective. Because civil society generally is dependent on private sector or the state for funding or for approval. Civil society isn't a group of really elected representatives, so they capture moral public opinion, but they don't necessarily represent public opinion in the sense of that they were directly elected. So that's very tenuous, and yet to see them as a third sector beyond the private sector and the public sector, meaning state, to see them as a viable third sector, I think that's still our premise and still our dream, but it hasn't happened yet. And my sense is really that what needs to, civil society needs to begin to understand something really important, and this would be what is in my toolkit, that the users of resources have to become the producers of their own resources, to the extent that that's possible. And if that was to take place, we would begin to diminish the division of labor in a direct way. And it's really the division of labor that is behind the premise of private property, to create different classes. To, you know, the outcome is pretty clear when we look at the difference between the Tea Party and the Occupy Wall Street movement. One is representing a different voice, and the other another voice, and you see the class differences there. And yet, you know, the premises are hardwired into our conditioning and into the framework that we have. So it shouldn't be confusing, like, why all those things continue to happen, and it'll continue to take place as long as we have the kind of division of labor that we have. We don't think critically about the division of labor. But if resource producers and users are the same people, when I say users, I mean consumers. If consumers and producers
Yeah, give a few examples of that, James.
are the same people, well, many groups on the internet are producing and using resources at the same time. The internet is a wonderful example of a commons where it's not privatized or regulated, you know, to the extent that there are chat rooms and there are resources available across the internet that people create the resources and they use them at the same time. Information is free information is a wonderful example of that. It's not without possibility that we can do the same kinds of things. There are blueprints out there now for making tractors and making all kinds of resources and technologies at a very low cost that are freely available, patents over the internet, that we could make our own resources if we wanted to in terms of those kinds of technologies. But the other factor is that in traditional cultures, that's all across the world today, people are consuming what they produce. I mean, that's what we did originally. And it's that spirit that leads us into the recognition that we're trustees rather than owners of the resources. And I think that's really very important, to come away from the perspective of the ownership to a perspective of trusteeship. That, to me, is the fundamental revolution that has to take place.
You were first?
Yes.
I guess I could use a pretty, like, down to the city scale example. So for instance, I own a house and I own a little bit of property. And so when you're talking about, you know, the commons, and if the world turns to this ideal, then what happens to, you know, say that private piece of property? Is it valued based on, you know, how much food it produces, how much, you know, how much carbon it sequesters, how much? Is there still value in private property in that way, or is it something different than that?
That's a great question. It brings up two different perspectives. The thing is, in talking about the commons, we have to picture a world where there still is going to be private property and still going to be state-managed property as well as commons. So it's not that everything turns into commons suddenly, but that there's kind of a tripartite system created rather than a dualistic system that we have now, where the commons will be much more influential and create a third sector that will have a greater dynamism in decision-making. That's the first thing. So it's not, so there will be hybrids of private property will not go away. We're not going to be able to roll back all the private systems that are out there, particularly private ownership of housing, and who would want to? I mean, owning your own house is really something pretty fantastic. I mean, it beats renting, obviously, and it has a lot of advantages. So, but how is value created? That's the other question. And you know, in a new kind of monetary system, you know, you could look at the Georgists, the Henry George School, and say, you know, they're talking about a difference between the value of land and the difference and a property tax. And if we could only go back to land valuation, that would be a revolution. The commons simply is built on that kind of premise, expanded to other commons. the genetic, the intellectual, the cultural, the social. And so we're not just talking about land, we're talking about all the cultural premises and other kinds of resources that are operative. They all create value. And so then it becomes a matter of what do we mean by value? We have a very difficult time of thinking about value as something that is non-monetizable value, fungible value. Very difficult. But there are alternative indicators that can produce value based on quality of life and well-being, sustainability, and those qualities now are being generated, and we know that we can discuss value in a completely different way. So I can't answer your question directly, but just to say that the same way that your family is a commons in your household, and what you do in the community is a commons, you already have some kind of sense of the value that's created out of that, even though you say it's inexpressible. How could I ever quantify it, or how could I ever describe it? Well, we do describe it all the time, but we have language that doesn't necessarily capture the richness of it. My sense is, and I know this very clearly, the French President Sarkozy has launched a global quest for alternative indicators of value as a way of getting away from GDP as the fundamental measurement. I think this is the right course. I don't think it's come to its fruition yet, but there are some amazing indicators of value that if we were to create an alternative way of measuring value, then I can answer more directly what it would mean to have a house and to really be able to express concrete value in terms that are non-monetizable. That day is coming. So.
And is it one system, or is it is it one system evaluation, or is it, and how do you come to consensus about that valuation? And that's my second question, and I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but.
Are you talking like bioregionally?
Yeah.
Or is it
a
global?
At the global level?
That would take a while to unpack that, unfortunately, and I don't think that's.
Yeah, we may.
That's fine.
We can get to that if you want to in a side conversation.
I'm happy to talk to you about that later.
When you were saying this, I was thinking my ancestors in New Mexico only had one officer of their towns. He was a guy that made sure that everybody got water from the canals to their property. So that's kind of a way of thinking of it. If you have private property where people own property, but the most important thing is that water gets to everybody equally. But, so that's one of the ways that would work. But Pennsylvania, there's another thing about private property and what the Tea Party is saying, which is, if I own this property, I have an inalienable right to do whatever I want to do on this property. I'm having a hard time of thinking how you turn that around.
I would like to address that because, and it really does have to do with what we're concrete